This is history for sixth grade. This should be the lesson right after the test. So it should be lesson 131. And we're going to cover a little bit more material than we would normally because I had moved the test from last Friday to the Monday. So we're just going to cover a couple different sections. But we're starting chapter 14 of your book, and that's on page 246. And so I'm going to go over what you're going to be reading, and then we're going to take a look at, and then I'll ask you some questions, okay? All right. Years of prosperity and opportunity. So in post-war, so after World War II, the economy was in a really good place. The government was, the United States was considered a very powerful government, and they were taking advantage of people working hard and establishing businesses and being productive and taking care of themselves. And because of that, our economy was at a really good place, and it led the way for some technology to be produced. And so one of the big things that we had was that people started having a lot of babies. And that was because they had money. Because if you think about it, a child costs money. You have to feed them, you have to clothe them. It even costs to have them, to have the child. And so there's a lot that goes into that. And so a lot of families would consider that before they would want to have another child. And so at this point, there was quite a bit of, we call it the baby boom, because in this time, our population went from 150 million in 1950 to nearly 180 million in 1960. So 30 million people, it grew 30 million people in those 10 years. And so a lot of the people wanted to live closer to the city instead of out in the rural areas, but they were able to live in the suburbs, which are the surrounding towns to a bigger city. And that was made possible by the automobile, because they could drive in to a job and not have to worry about the transportation, if they could get there or not, because they had their car. But another thing that was quickly becoming popular was jet airplanes. And there was new technology for different things. A man by the name of Dr. Jonas Salk, developed the polio vaccine, and that really helped to prevent the spread of that disease. It was very dangerous. We have at least one president that I know of that had polio, and it was a disease that took the lives of many kids in those days. And so that was a major breakthrough, but also from that, there were other vaccines that were developed, like measles and mumps and diphtheria, tetanus, the whooping cough, and many others. And some of those are great to have. And one of the things that with the technology is that television became very popular. And by the middle of the 1950s, over 90% of the American homes had a television. Now, the screens were small and they only offered a few channels, but it was still something that the family could just relax and watch in the evening. And they had the more leisure time, and so they took more vacations. Now we're going to talk about some influential people that were during this time, that we had many groups of the ethnic groups in our country that were wanting to be a part of our American government, a part of our culture, a part of just just be considered a part of us. And that was, it was a good thing. We had Asians, Africans, Latin Americans, American Indians, and so we're going to look at a few different of those. I know that Ryan, you'll be enthusiastic to talk about Jackie Robinson. He was the first Black to play Major League Baseball, and he led the way for others to play in major sports in our country. And this has only been happening in the last 70 years or so that we've actually had many of these people as part of our sports and a part of our government, and we're going to see many of them, but it started out slow, and they had to overcome many obstacles. And so Jackie Robinson was even elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1962 and became a role model. There was another woman by the name of Marian Anderson, and she was a beautiful singer. She sang opera songs, and at the age of 6, they realized that she had this incredible gift, and she even went and toured in Europe and sang for people over there. And she was one of the greatest opera singers of the age in this time. And by 1939, she was recognized as that, and she had asked to sing at the Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C., but she was refused. They refused to let her sing there because she was Black. And she, instead of causing a big scene or trying to sing anyway there, she went and stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and she sang on an Easter Sunday morning, and sang to over 75,000 people, and people of all color and race. And she was later she was admitted to the New York City Metropolitan Opera, which is a very prestigious opera house. But she served God. She feared God, and she served him, and she used her talent for God. And she also believed that she could peacefully bring about change, and it did influence others. One of the things, we have the civil rights movement that was very there were many people that came up against opposition of having these civil rights, being able to do things that other people did and being refused because of the color of their skin. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had this speech, and he's well remembered for this speech. I'm just going to read the couple paragraphs that we have in the book. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." And that dream has been one that many people have wished in America. And there's been progress made in that. There's been many people that look at people not for what they look like or who they are, but for how they act and their character. And that should be how we view everyone, because the Bible does say that all men are created equal, and we don't want to judge someone based on their appearance. It's very wrong to do that. Another woman that was part of this civil rights was Rosa Parks, and she was from Montgomery, Alabama, and she was riding a bus one day, and in that town and in those days, they if you were black or a different color skin, you weren't white, you were riding a bus, and somebody got on that was white skin, you had to give up and get up and give your seat to them. And she refused to give up her seat, and she was arrested for it. And she did lead the way to desegregate their bus system there in Montgomery, and that did happen in the next by 1957. And there was also the schools did not have were segregated at that time as well. It was right before that the schools were segregated, and so black children weren't allowed to go to school with the white children, and this was very at this time they went to court about it, and it was the ruling is known as Brown versus the Board of Education, and they decided that they were going to desegregate it, which meant that didn't matter what color your skin were, you could come to school together, which is a very good thing, because children need to be able to learn together and learn to get along, and learn to see each other as equals. And that's what this was about. And so there are many different groups that that you read about. And so the Asian Americans came mostly because of the communism. They came for freedom. The American Indians, those are actually the ones that were here in our country before the Europeans came over, and there's nearly 2 million of them there. They make up a great part of our population, and we know that they were put on reservations in the 1800s, but by 2000, nearly half of them live off of a reservation and just live in normal, in amongst everyone else. And they've even held positions in the government, even Senate and Vice President. And you're going to read about that. The Hispanic Americans are becoming our fastest growing and possibly the largest minority, because they come from many different countries. We have many from Mexico, Central America, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and there was in Cuba the communist dictator Fidel Castro overthrew the government in 1959, and several hundred people came and sought refuge in the U.S. because they wanted freedom from that type of government. And they've also served in many different capacities, the Surgeon General, members of Congress. In 2009, we had our first female Hispanic Supreme Court Justice, Sonia Sotomayor, and that leads the way for more people to fill those roles, and it's exciting to see. The future for minorities in America. You read about Mel Martinez, and what he said there says, regardless of where you are from, what language you speak, or the color of your skin, if you share the American dream of a brighter tomorrow, if you pursue it with respect for the law and for others, with an abiding faith in God, all things are possible. And I think he says that best, that if you are going to pursue the American dream, but within the laws and with faith, then all things are possible. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas had realized the importance of moral character. And he also has a speech, part of his speech there. I'll let you read that. The proper role of government. Now, the role of government is to protect, but it should not be to provide for you. Those are two different things. Your protection is against foreign enemies and those that are within our country that are not following the laws of our country. And that should be guaranteed by our government. But this idea that the government should provide you with food, clothing, and you don't work for all of that, and it shows that it makes people lazy, and it makes people not want to work hard, and that's really against what God has for us. We should be working to the best of our ability, and we're going to see some of the next things that have happened are actually that they are from those hardworking Americans, and because of without that, the hardworking Americans, we wouldn't have some of the things that we enjoy today. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the next president. He was a general in World War II, and he was elected in 1952. Now, he wanted to ensure economic prosperity and build defenses against communism. He was totally against communism, which is what we want. And there was an alliance that was made called NATO. It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was an alliance of Western Europe nations, Canada, and the U.S. against communism. And it began in 1949 under Truman, and it was this organization played a major role in the eventual collapse of the communist government in the Soviet Union, which helps to create, to open up the Soviet Union for a free government, so that they are not under that communist rule. With the economy being prospered, they created the roadway through America, so the interstate highway system that we travel on today. And there was also the completion of the St. Lawrence Seaway, and that provides shipping from the Great Lakes to the ocean. And so then they can take, and it helps with Canada and the US that are right there on the Great Lakes. And so then they can ship from that area and travel out to the ocean to take it across. The last thing that we're going to look at is the space age. And we have looked at this with science, but we'll look at it in history. National Aeronautics and Space Administration is NASA, and that was started in 1958. And President Eisenhower, because there was such a boom in the economy, and he had extra revenue, and he had the knowledge for many of these, for the technology needed to send someone to space, put money into this program so that they could launch and go to space. And so we know that the first American to fly in space was Alan B. Shepard Jr. in 1961. And then the following year, in 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. And then 1969, a few years later, Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the surface of the moon. And the technology that they have developed with NASA and the space age weapon technology, and to go against communism, it's just one part of it. But many peaceful uses, especially in computer software, were also developed. So not everything that NASA did was to help with wartime, but it was also to help with the technology, with computers and many other things with that. So that is the pages for that we are up to. And so I'm going to have you, for homework, read pages 252 to 255, and then go back and go to the comprehension checkup at the end of the the chapter checkup. Do CCU 14, section A, numbers 1 through 9, and section C, numbers 1 and 2 on paper. And I'm going to ask you the questions from the comprehension check on page 250, and if you know the answer, go ahead and say it. The system of producing and distributing goods was what? That would be the economy. The economy, very good. The vaccine developed by Dr. Jonas Salk. Yes, that would be polio. Who was the first Black Major League Baseball player? Could be mean and tell Ryan not to answer this one. No, he can answer. Okay, Jackie Robinson. The act that guaranteed equal voting, housing, and job rights to ethnic minorities. What was that act? That was the 1964 Civil Rights Act, okay? So go ahead and go back and read those pages 246 to 252, and then you can read forward to 255 and answer the CCU, which is on the piece of, or on the instructions that I have that I gave your parents. Okay, we'll see you next time.